We talk about boomers constantly, usually as a punchline or a problem, but very rarely do we actually slow down and examine the psychology that shaped them. Not the memes, not the stereotypes, but the internal wiring of a generation that grew up during one of the most unusual periods in modern history. Baby boomers, born roughly between 1946 and 1964, were raised in the long shadow of World War II and came of age during a time of unprecedented economic expansion. And that timing matters more than people realize, because psychology is not formed in a vacuum, it is shaped by the invisible assumptions of the world you grow up in. Imagine growing up in a society where nearly every signal you receive tells you that things are getting better, not worse, where adults speak about the future with confidence instead of anxiety. Jobs were plentiful, wages rose alongside productivity, unions had power, and for many families, one income was enough to buy a house, raise children, and still save for retirement. This wasn't just an economic condition, it was an emotional atmosphere. Psychologically, that environment creates what researchers call a high-expectancy worldview. You grow up assuming effort will be rewarded, that institutions basically work, and that the system, while imperfect, is fundamentally on your side. That belief becomes automatic, almost unconscious, baked into your nervous system long before you ever have language for it. It shapes how you interpret success, failure, and fairness for the rest of your life. Boomers were also the first generation fully raised on mass media optimism. Television didn't just entertain, it quietly trained people how the world was supposed to function. Sitcom families solved conflicts in 30 minutes, authority figures were flawed but well-intentioned. Problems existed, but they were temporary, manageable, and usually resolved by the end of the episode. The future was framed as something you advanced toward, not something you braced yourself against. When psychologists talk about boomers having confidence that borders on entitlement, this is where it begins. Not because they were spoilt as individuals, but because the entire cultural environment reinforced the idea that progress was automatic. If you showed up, played by the rules, respected authority, and waited your turn, life would eventually reward you. That expectation wasn't arrogance, it was rational based on the data they were given at the time. This expectation deeply shaped how boomers relate to work. For many of them, a job was not just a paycheck, it was identity, status, and purpose rolled into one. Companies weren't just employers, they were long-term partners. Loyalty made sense in a world with pensions, predictable promotions, and rare layoffs. You committed yourself to an organization, and in return, it committed to you. That social contract felt real. So when boomers criticize younger generations for job hopping or lacking work ethic, they're often projecting from this outdated framework, assuming the rules are still the same. What they often fail to see is that the economic contract that shaped them has been dismantled. Loyalty without security no longer feels virtuous, it feels naive. But from their perspective, abandoning that model feels like a moral failure, not an adaptation to new realities. Boomers were also raised in a strongly hierarchical world. Teachers were not debated, they were obeyed. Parents were authorities, not negotiators. Institutions were trusted by default. This produced a psychology that values credentials, titles, seniority, and formal structures. Respect flowed downward through hierarchy. If someone held a position, they were assumed to have earned it through time and discipline. This is why many boomers struggle in environments where authority is flat, informal, or openly challenged. It feels chaotic and destabilizing, not because they are inherently rigid, but because hierarchy was the scaffolding that made their world intelligible. Remove that scaffolding and the structure of meaning starts to wobble. At the same time, boomers lived through enormous social upheaval. Civil rights movements, the Vietnam War, political assassinations, and Watergate all unfolded during their formative years. This created a strange psychological duality. On one hand, they internalized trust in institutions. On the other, they learned that those same institutions could deceive, manipulate, or collapse. The result was a generation deeply attached to ideals, but emotionally conflicted about reality. They want the system to work the way it was promised it would. When it doesn't, the response is often denial, anger, or defensiveness rather than rapid adaptation. That reaction isn't stupidity or ignorance, it's grief. Boomers are grieving a world they were assured was permanent. Another defining feature of boomer psychology is their relationship with scarcity. Even those who grew up during prosperity were raised by parents shaped by the Great Depression and World War II. That fear of loss didn't vanish, it was inherited. Save your money. Don't waste food. Don't rock the boat. Security matters above all else. This is why boomers often fixate on home ownership, stable careers, and tangible assets. To them, these are not luxury goals or status symbols, they are survival markers. Proof that you made it out of uncertainty alive and secured your place in the world. Boomers also internalized a powerful belief in personal responsibility. If something went wrong, you were expected to deal with it privately and move forward. Emotional expression was discouraged, especially for men. Mental health struggles were framed as character flaws rather than medical conditions. This produced a generation that often appears emotionally closed off or dismissive, but beneath that surface is deep discomfort with vulnerability. Asking for help feels like failure because independence was framed as moral virtue. When boomers criticize younger generations for openly discussing anxiety, burnout, or trauma, they are not rejecting the feelings themselves. They are reacting to a rule they were taught early on that pain is something you endure silently, not something you share publicly. One of the most misunderstood aspects of boomer psychology is their resistance to rapid change. It's not that they hate technology or new ideas, it's that their internal model of the world assumes stability and continuity. When the rules keep changing, it creates cognitive dissonance. They invested decades mastering one game, only to watch the board suddenly rearrange itself. That produces frustration rather than curiosity. Learning entirely new systems later in life feels unfair when you were promised that mastery would eventually lead to comfort and security. And yet, for all the criticism aimed at boomers, there is something quietly admirable about them. They believed in building things that lasted, in institutions, in long-term planning, in the idea that society was something you invested in, not something you exploited. They planted trees whose shade they fully expected to sit under. The tragedy is that many of those trees were cut down by forces they neither created nor understood, leaving younger generations angry and boomers genuinely confused about why the future doesn't resemble the one they were promised. Boomers are not villains. They are products of a historical moment that no longer exists. Their psychology was shaped by expansion, optimism, hierarchy, and promises that felt unbreakable at the time. Understanding them doesn't mean excusing every mistake or ignoring the damage caused by outdated assumptions. It means recognizing that when they look at the modern world and say this isn't how it's supposed to work, they're not being malicious. They're reacting to a deep mismatch between the world they were wired for and the one that actually emerged. And that gap, more than anything else, explains the generational tension we see today. What often gets missed is that this tension isn't just cultural, it's neurological. When the environment changes faster than the beliefs that helped you survive, the brain resists not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Boomers are navigating a world where many of the cues they trusted have inverted. Stability now feels fragile, authority is questioned, long-term planning feels risky. For Generation Y, for continuity, that constant uncertainty is exhausting. And understanding that exhaustion is essential if we want intergenerational conversations to move beyond blame and toward clarity.